The winter of 1,944 inches Europe was a crucible, a relentless test of endurance, strategy, and sheer willpower. Across frozen fields and shattered villages, the Allied forces faced a logistical nightmare unlike anything seen before. Supplies were the lifeblood of armies. Their absence meant hunger, freezing soldiers, stalled tanks, and delayed offensives. Every nation involved in the push against Nazi Germany understood that victory hinged not just on the courage of men on the front lines, but on the efficiency of the convoys that brought food, ammunition, and fuel to the ever-moving battlefronts. Among the hundreds of convoys crisscrossing Europe, one stood out, earning a reputation that would be whispered across Allied command posts: Canada's Maple Leaf Up convoys. These weren't just trucks or trains moving supplies, they were lifelines, arteries pumping hope into the war-torn heart of Europe. The story of these convoys is remarkable, not just for their speed and efficiency, but for the ingenuity, determination, and sheer audacity that Canadian logisticians, drivers, and support crews brought to the table. To understand the significance of the Maple Leaf Up operation, we need to step back and see the scale of the challenge the Allies faced. After the D-Day landings, Allied forces expanded rapidly, moving through France, Belgium, and into the Netherlands. The farther they advanced, the longer their supply lines stretched, snaking hundreds of miles across devastated countryside, bombed bridges, and crumbling roads. Every mile added risk. Every delay could cost lives. And the German forces, still entrenched in pockets across the continent, were constantly striking, ambushing, and sabotaging these lifelines wherever they could. The problem was complex. British, American, and other Allied convoys were often slowed by bureaucratic procedures, differing priorities, and sometimes simple miscommunication. Convoys became targets, vulnerable to air raids, artillery fire, and the unforgiving European winter. Snow, mud, and bomb craters turned roads into impassable obstacles. Trucks broke down, drivers froze in their cabins, entire shipments of critical supplies would sometimes vanish before reaching their destinations. Amidst this chaos, the Canadians approached the problem differently. They didn't just move supplies, they optimized the system, rethinking routes, schedules, and convoy organization. Their approach was rooted in discipline, practicality, and an unwavering commitment to getting the job done. It wasn't flashy. There were no grand speeches, no parades, just careful planning, intelligent use of resources, and men willing to face every hazard on the road to ensure their fellow soldiers were not left wanting. The origins of the Maple Leaf Up convoys can be traced back to the Canadian Army's experience in earlier campaigns. From Sicily to Italy, Canadian logisticians had learned valuable lessons about speed, flexibility, and the importance of morale. They understood that a well-fed, well-equipped army was not just stronger, it was faster, more resilient, and more deadly. By the time the Allies were pushing across northern Europe, Canada had refined a system that allowed their supply lines to consistently outpace those of their allies. But this efficiency wasn't simply a matter of better trucks or stronger engines. It was built on meticulous attention to detail. Convoys were organized by priority, with the most essential supplies, ammunition, fuel, medical supplies receiving top clearance. Drivers were trained to navigate difficult terrain quickly and safely. Communication networks were streamlined so that convoy leaders could respond instantly to threats, roadblocks, or mechanical failures. And perhaps most importantly, a culture of mutual support and teamwork was cultivated among the men of the Maple Leaf Up program. It's important to grasp what these men faced on the ground. Picture a long line of trucks snaking through the Ardennes or the Rhineland. Snow falls thick and heavy, blinding headlights and coating the roads in ice. German artillery is still active nearby. Mines and shell craters punctuate every kilometre. Mechanical failures are inevitable. And yet, these convoys move with a precision and discipline that is almost astonishing. Drivers lean on their training, on each other, and on the sheer necessity of their mission. One breakdown isn't just an inconvenience, it could block the entire line. Every decision, every manoeuvre, carries weight. Even the vehicles themselves were a reflection of Canadian ingenuity. Standardized maintenance schedules, spare parts distribution, and preemptive repairs kept trucks running longer and reduced delays that plagued other Allied convoys. Mechanics were embedded directly within the units, ready to fix a transmission in the freezing cold or patch a radiator leaking antifreeze before it turned into a disaster. It was a system built not only for speed, but for reliability under the harshest conditions imaginable. The human element cannot be overstated. These were men from across Canada, farmers, tradesmen, former sailors thrust into a war on foreign soil. Their sense of duty was matched by their resourcefulness. They learned to read the terrain, anticipate obstacles, and improvise solutions when the unexpected struck. There are countless accounts of drivers and crews literally digging trucks out of snowdrifts, repairing engines in the open, and guiding convoys through minefields, all under the threat of enemy fire. Every successful delivery was a testament to courage and endurance. And yet, for all their effectiveness, the Maple Leaf Up convoys did not operate in isolation. Coordination with Allied commands, understanding of frontline priorities, and intelligence about German troop movements were essential. Convoys had to be flexible, able to adjust routes and schedules on a moment's notice. The Canadians developed a reputation for being reliable under pressure, a reputation that earned the trust of commanders across multiple Allied nations. By the time the campaign moved into the Netherlands and Germany, these convoys were operating at an almost legendary efficiency. They could navigate hundreds of kilometers of treacherous terrain in days, while other Allied supply lines struggled to cover far shorter distances. Their success was not just about moving goods, it was about keeping an entire army in motion, enabling offensive operations, and ultimately shaping the outcome of the war in Europe. The story of the Maple Leaf Up convoys is one of determination, strategy, and quiet heroism. It is a tale that underscores the vital importance of logistics in warfare, showing that wars are not only won by tanks, guns, or soldiers on the front lines, but by the unglamorous, often invisible work of moving supplies faster and more efficiently than the enemy can disrupt. As the Allies pushed deeper into Europe, every mile covered by these convoys was a mile closer to liberation, a mile closer to victory. Yet, behind every successful journey lay danger, ingenuity, and courage that few outside the convoy ever saw. This was not just supply work, it was a lifeline, a strategic edge, and a symbol of Canadian resolve in the face of one of the greatest logistical challenges in military history. The Maple Leaf Up convoys were more than just trucks rolling through Europe. They were a moving testament to Canadian ingenuity and courage. As the Allies pushed further into Belgium, the Netherlands, and eventually Germany, the convoy system evolved into a finely tuned machine, capable of adapting to any challenge the war could throw at it. Yet, behind the efficiency lay countless stories of risk, ingenuity, and determination that would have been almost impossible to believe if they hadn't actually happened. One of the most remarkable aspects of these convoys was their speed. On paper, it might seem simple. Trucks move from point A to point B. But in practice, the roads were rarely anything close to simple. Bombed-out bridges, cratered highways, and snow-choked paths turned every mile into a potential disaster. Yet the Canadians developed a rhythm, a system that kept their convoys moving when others stalled. Convoy leaders mapped routes not only for efficiency, but for safety, scouting detours around active German positions, anticipating choke points, and even timing movements to avoid air raids. They became almost prophetic in their planning, foreseeing problems before they materialized. Speed wasn't achieved through recklessness. Every truck, every driver, every mechanic knew their role. Drivers often rotated shifts, braving freezing nights and the constant threat of attack. Mechanics rode alongside the convoys, tools in hand, ready to fix anything from a frozen radiator to a snapped axle without delaying the mission. The trucks themselves were maintained to an extraordinary degree. Canadian logistics officers knew that a single breakdown could create a domino effect, halting supplies for miles. Spare parts, fuel, and food were stocked with precision, allowing the convoys to keep moving even in the most extreme conditions. The human stories from these convoys are as incredible as the logistical achievements. One winter morning in 1945, a convoy moving through the Ardennes became trapped in a sudden blizzard. Visibility dropped to mere meters, and the narrow roads quickly turned into slick sheets of ice. Trucks skidded, some tipped into ditches, others stalled in snowdrifts. Yet, through sheer determination, the drivers and their crews worked together, digging vehicles free, pushing them back onto the road, and guiding the convoy forward. By the time they reached their destination, several days' worth of supplies had been delivered on time, against impossible odds. The Canadian convoys also became masters of coordination. They implemented a system of prioritization that ensured the most vital supplies, ammunition for artillery, fuel for tanks, and medical supplies for frontline hospitals, were always at the front of the line. This might seem obvious, but in the chaos of war, supply lines often collapsed because of poor prioritization. The Canadians understood that the difference between victory and defeat could hinge on whether a single artillery unit ran out of shells. Every decision was calculated, every truck placement deliberate. Intelligence played a critical role too. The convoys relied on constant updates about German troop movements, sabotage attempts, and the condition of roads and bridges. Scouts, both in the air and on the ground, provided real-time information, allowing convoy leaders to reroute trucks on the fly. This level of adaptability gave the Canadians a remarkable edge. While other Allied supply lines were delayed for days by ambushes or blocked roads, the Maple Leaf Up convoys seemed almost untouchable, moving with the precision of a machine yet guided by human ingenuity. But danger was never far away. German forces, desperate to slow the Allied advance, targeted supply lines relentlessly. Mines, artillery, and sniper fire were constant threats. There are accounts of Canadian drivers continuing their route even after trucks were damaged or partially destroyed, refusing to leave supplies behind. In one instance, a driver lost a wheel to a shell hit but managed to keep the truck moving by improvising a makeshift axle reinforcement with whatever materials were available. His convoy arrived at its destination hours later, and the supplies reached soldiers who would otherwise have gone without. The convoys weren't just technical marvels, they were a source of morale as well. Soldiers at the front learned they could count on the Maple Leaf Up trucks to bring what they needed, often ahead of other Allied deliveries. In a war where uncertainty was the only constant, the Canadians' reliability became a psychological edge. Knowing that supplies would arrive on time allowed commanders to plan offensives with confidence and troops to fight without the gnawing fear of running out of essentials. Another fascinating element was the speed with which the convoys could be organized and mobilized. When a new push was ordered, Canadian logistics officers could assemble a convoy almost immediately, coordinating trucks, drivers, mechanics, and supplies with remarkable efficiency. This level of readiness was unmatched, and it frequently meant the difference between exploiting a breakthrough in the enemy lines and watching the opportunity slip away. The Canadian approach was not without innovation. Convoy movement patterns were carefully analyzed and adjusted based on terrain, weather, and enemy activity. Trucks were grouped strategically heavier, slower vehicles at the front to pave the way for lighter, faster trucks behind. Some convoys even employed what was effectively a mobile repair system, with mechanics stationed at intervals along the route, ready to leap into action at a moment's notice. Every innovation, no matter how small, contributed to the overall speed and reliability of the operation. Perhaps the most remarkable legacy of the Maple Leaf Up convoys lies in the sheer scale of the operation. At any given time, dozens of convoys were moving through Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany, carrying everything from ammunition to rations to medical supplies. Each convoy, individually, was a story of courage and ingenuity. Collectively, they formed a lifeline that allowed the Allies to maintain relentless pressure on German forces, keeping the war moving forward when delays could have been catastrophic. Despite harsh winters, hostile terrain, and constant threats, the Canadians maintained a record that was almost unprecedented. Convoys that would have taken other Allied units days or even weeks were completed in a fraction of the time. Bridges were repaired or bypassed in record time. Roads were cleared of snow and debris. Supplies reached the front lines faster than anyone could have imagined. The speed and efficiency of the Maple Leaf Up system became a benchmark, a standard of excellence that other Allied nations sought to emulate. These achievements were not the product of luck. They were the result of relentless preparation, courage under fire, and an unwavering commitment to the mission. Every driver, every mechanic, every officer involved in the convoys understood that what they were doing was far bigger than themselves. They were keeping armies alive, enabling offensives, and shaping the course of the war in Europe. The story of these convoys is filled with moments of tension, ingenuity, and triumph. It is a story of ordinary men accomplishing extraordinary feats under the most extreme circumstances, and yet, despite all of this, much of the world remained unaware of the scale and importance of their achievement. The Maple Leaf Up convoys didn't make headlines in the same way as battles or heroic charges, but in the end, they were just as vital, perhaps even more so, to the ultimate victory of the Allied forces in Europe. As the Allies pushed closer to Germany, the stakes grew higher. Supply lines became more crucial, enemy resistance more desperate, and the consequences of delay more severe. But the Canadians met each challenge head-on, continuing to set records for speed, efficiency, and ingenuity. Every successful convoy was a victory in itself, a triumph of planning, courage, and teamwork. The Maple Leaf Up convoys were a quiet, steadfast force, moving relentlessly through the chaos of war. They carried not just food, ammunition, and fuel, but hope, determination, and the promise of liberation. And as the Allies advanced deeper into Europe, it became clear that the men and machines of these convoys were more than logistical units. They were a symbol of Canadian excellence, resilience, and the unbreakable human spirit in the face of unimaginable challenges. As 1945 unfolded, the war in Europe reached its final, decisive stages. German forces were retreating on multiple fronts, yet they remained dangerous, desperate, and unpredictable. Every bridge blown, every road cratered, and every mined highway could have brought an advancing army to a grinding halt. In the chaos of collapsing defences, supply lines were no longer just important, they were the lifeblood of an entire campaign. And in this critical moment, the Maple Leaf Up convoys proved their true worth. The Canadians were no longer simply moving supplies, they were shaping the battlefield itself. Their ability to deliver essential fuel, ammunition, and rations ahead of schedule allowed armoured divisions to press forward relentlessly. Artillery units could fire without interruption, infantry units could advance without fear of running out of food or medical care. Commanders began to rely on the Canadians' convoys as a strategic advantage, knowing that wherever a Maple Leaf Up convoy travelled, soldiers at the front would be ready to fight, resupply, and hold the line. One convoy, in particular, would become legendary. Tasked with moving a massive shipment of fuel and munitions across 100 kilometres of bombed-out roads in the Rhineland, the convoy faced blizzards, shellfire, and treacherous ice. Trucks skidded into ditches, engines failed, and the threat of German ambush was constant. Yet, against all odds, the drivers pressed forward. Mechanics worked through freezing nights to keep trucks running. Drivers improvised, pushing vehicles with ropes, chaining tires to ice-crusted roads, and navigating routes that had been deemed impassable. When they finally arrived, every single crate of supplies had been delivered intact, allowing a stalled offensive to resume and forcing German forces into a retreat that would accelerate the end of the war in that sector. Stories like this were not isolated incidents, they were repeated across Europe. Convoys moved with speed, precision, and resilience that other Allied forces struggled to match. Soldiers on the front lines often remarked that the Canadians seemed almost superhuman in their ability to maintain supply chains where others failed. And it wasn't just the speed that impressed, it was the reliability. When a Maple Leaf Up convoy was scheduled, the men at the front knew it would arrive, no matter the conditions, no matter the obstacles. The human cost of these achievements was immense. Drivers worked for days without rest. Mechanics risked frostbite and injury, and every mile carried the constant threat of enemy action. Letters home described bitter cold, relentless snow, and the ever-present fear of attack. Yet, amidst the hardship, there was pride. Pride in the precision of their work, in the lives saved by timely supplies, and in the role they played in the larger machinery of victory. It was this combination of courage, skill, and determination that allowed the Maple Leaf Up convoys to outpace every other Allied supply line in Europe. By spring, as the Allies entered Germany itself, the impact of the Canadian convoys became undeniable. Frontline troops, exhausted by months of fighting, were continuously resupplied. Tanks rumbled forward with fuel and ammunition in abundance. Hospitals received life-saving medical equipment, and soldiers were fed even in the most remote and dangerous positions. The maple leaf-up system had become an engine of war, one that transformed logistical efficiency into a direct force multiplier on the battlefield. The speed and reliability of the Canadian convoys also had psychological effects on both sides. Allied troops gained confidence, morale soared, and commanders could plan ambitious operations without fear of running short on supplies. German forces, on the other hand, realized they could not disrupt the Canadians' supply lines as effectively as they had hoped. Where other convoys stalled, Canadian trucks pressed forward. Where roads were blocked, drivers found detours. The enemy's desperation grew as they watched the unstoppable flow of trucks, supplies, and determination rolling inexorably toward victory. What set these convoys apart was not technology, nor sheer numbers, but the human factor. Men trained for efficiency, for adaptability, and for courage under fire made the difference. Mechanics fixed engines in the open, drivers navigated impossible terrain, and leaders coordinated complex logistics with split-second decisions. The maple leaf-up convoys were not just vehicles, they were living proof that human skill, ingenuity, and willpower could overcome almost any obstacle. As the final days of the European campaign approached, the Canadians' work was visible everywhere. Supplies reached even the most isolated units. Armoured divisions could continue their relentless push into Germany. Hospitals were fully stocked, and the armies of liberation moved with confidence. The speed and efficiency of the maple leaf-up convoys had become a decisive factor, proving that victory on the battlefield often depends as much on logistics as it does on combat itself. By the time the war ended in Europe, these convoys had covered thousands of kilometers, delivered millions of tons of supplies, and earned the respect of commanders, soldiers, and civilians alike. The record of the maple leaf-up convoys was not written in medals or headlines, but in the tangible impact on the battlefield, the lives saved, the operations enabled, and the relentless momentum they maintained in the fight against tyranny. Today, the story of these convoys stands as a testament to the quiet, unsung heroes of war. The drivers, mechanics, and planners who faced freezing temperatures, enemy fire, and impossible terrain with determination and skill are a reminder that wars are not only won by weapons and soldiers, but by those who ensure the fight can continue. The Canadians of the maple leaf-up convoys achieved something extraordinary. They turned supply lines into instruments of victory, proving that efficiency, courage, and ingenuity can shape the outcome of history itself. As we reflect on the European campaign, it becomes clear that the maple leaf-up convoys were more than logistics. They were a symbol of resilience, of human ingenuity under pressure, and of the quiet heroism that often goes unnoticed in the shadow of battle. Every mile driven, every engine repaired, and every supply delivered was a step closer to liberation, a step closer to victory, and a lasting testament to the men and women who made it all possible. In the end, the story of Canada's maple leaf-up convoys is not just a story of trucks, fuel, and ammunition. It is a story of courage, determination, and the extraordinary power of people working together toward a single goal. They outpaced every other Allied supply line in Europe, not because they had better machines, but because they had better resolve, better planning, and better hearts. Their legacy reminds us that behind every great victory, there are countless untold stories of perseverance, sacrifice, and ingenuity, the lifeblood of history itself.